Yes.
All right, it's
Thank you.
recording. Okay.
So for those of you who don't aren't here or have friends who are shut out because of the number, please tell them to go to B'nai Tikva website and they will be able to see the recording.
All right. Okay, wonderful. So without any further ado, I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to go now and share my screen, and we're going to get into that. And let me just make sure it's all set up correctly. It is. And okay, so we're looking good. So before we start, we should really locate ourselves and where exactly are we, what are we talking about? So here's the map of the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal and modern day Spain. But of course, the period we're talking about, it was all very different. It was different kingdoms, okay? There wasn't the idea of Spain as a unified entity really until the 15th century. That's really Isabella and Ferdinand, their idea of wanting to have one nation, one people, one culture, one religion, one language, and they're the ones who really start unifying all the various kingdoms onto one larger kingdom, which eventually, as the centuries progress, will be what we call modern day Spain and then Portugal. But where we are right now is the Iberian Peninsula. And what's I think you can see my cursor here. What's important to remember and to look at is the topography. Spain's quite large. There's a mountain range, the Sierra Nevada down here in the south, and then the Pyrenees. And this is important to remember that the reason why when the Muslims come in from Morocco, they push very quickly and take over most of the Iberian Peninsula within a few years. Basically they'll get stopped by the Pyrenees and don't continue on into France and the rest of Europe because of the geography. We are going to be focusing today on Cordoba. There's Cordoba in the south in the region called Andalusia, which is actually the Spanish from the Arabic word al-Andalus. And it seems to be an Arabic translation for the area of the Visigoths. And that's because that's who they conquered from. That's who was reigning here. They were Christian. Visigoths were living in Spain for a few centuries when the Muslims come in. But I want to put this into a larger context because no culture is in a vacuum. And what we're seeing, what we'll be looking at a little bit with the Muslim invasion into Sfarad, as I'll be calling it Sfarad because again, that term Spain is a much later term. We have the clash between the Muslim and Christian worlds. And as the Christians start to what they call their reconquista, the reconquest, which is reconquering those what once were Christian territories that became Muslim territories, and now they want, of course, to turn them back into Christian territories, is in direct parallel with the Crusades, which the official call for the Crusades was to free free Jerusalem from the Muslim infidel, correct? That's the way the Crusades were always seen. It's a few centuries of many Crusades, not all the Crusades. In fact, most of them actually didn't take place in Palestine or the Holy Land. They took place in other places. But the Reconquista is part of the Crusade movement. It was given that papal authenticity, it was considered part of the larger Crusades. Because the same notion of Christians reconquering their lands that were in Muslim hands. And just a date to note to put all of this into context is that Jerusalem, the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099. Okay, so we can see already 1100, where already they're making their way, and very soon after that will take over Toledo, which will become the Christian capital in a way as they continue to push south. But let's go back into our timeline. We've oriented ourselves in terms of space, but now in terms of time. And basically, the Jewish story in Sfarad is about 1,000 years long. It starts, as I mentioned, in the Visigoth period. So the Visigoths are Christians from the German area who come in. They're very radical. They are very, very anti-Semitic. It is not fun to be living in a Jewish community under the Visigoths. We do know of a number of small Jewish communities there where there's a small amount of archaeological evidence of Jews living in the 2nd century already, 2nd and 3rd century in Sfarad. But that was when it was part of the Roman Empire, but there's very little, and definitely nothing that we can really reconstitute what the Jewish community was really like. And in 711, the Muslims come crashing in from the south, the Moors, from Morocco. And as I mentioned before, in a very short amount of time, they basically take over the entire Iberian Peninsula. And only about 80 years later do they sort of lose just the area of northern Catalan. So like Barcelona in north only is under Muslim control for about 50 years, but most of Sfarad are going to be under Muslim control for centuries, some of them, multiple centuries, if not one or two at the least. In 756, the Caliphate, so sort of like the power center, is actually founded in Cordoba. And that is where it is for a few centuries. And that has huge implications on the status of Cordoba as a city, as a province of Andalusia. It's a huge shift at that time. And at almost all other times, the Caliphate or the Muslim power centers would be farther in the east. They would either be bouncing between Cairo or Damascus or Baghdad. So to shift so far west is a huge change in the Muslim world and in the Muslim empire. That time of when Cordoba is really at its height is also the time when Chazdai ibn Shaprut, I don't know how many of you have heard of him before. I'd be a little surprised if you know so much about him, but he's really, really important, and he will be the focus of part of the presentation today. Eventually, the Caliphate is going to lose some power. It's going to split into Taifa kingdoms, which are just sort of like city-states. And eventually, as Cordoba starts to decline, other areas are going to rise, and also there's going to be strife amongst the different Muslim rulers, and that really will be the entry point for the Reconquista, for the Christians to again start to take over the territory. We're going to meet Yehuda Halevi in the terms of our presentation, who's a great poet who lived, who's one generation ahead of Maimonides. And already between Yehuda Halevi and Maimonides' time, we have a period where the Almoravids, so these are different Muslims coming in from Morocco, come in, take over, and they're much more fanatic, much harsher, and Jewish life takes a turn for the worst under them. And then following them is the Almohades, who are even worse. And again, the splinter in the Muslim world, and definitely in the Muslim rulers in this area, is what allows the Reconquista to really gain speed. Jumping ahead, 13th century is the time of Nachmanides, of the Ramban, who's living in Barcelona. And then we start to get to what I call the beginning of the end. So in 1391, there are anti-Jewish riots in Seville, which end up, they're pogroms, which end up spreading throughout the rest of Sfarad. And this is when many Jews at that time start to leave, or they're forced to convert. And now we have the issue of all these Jews who are now new Christians or conversos. And that sets up for about 50 years later, anti-converso laws and the Inquisition. And the Inquisition did not go after Jews, it went after conversos. Conversos were considered to be new Christians who were Judaicizing, who were reverting back to their Jewish ways, which is heresy. So that's the time period where about 50 years after the riots, we have the Inquisition, and about 50 years after that, 1492, the expulsion. And that ends about, what, as I mentioned, 1,000 years of a Jewish settlement, of which hundreds of years of that was incredibly vibrant. And we refer to the expulsion as really an exile within an exile, because the Jewish community of Sfarad already saw themselves as the exiled from the Holy Land, from the destruction of the Second Temple. And then here they were being exiled again. I just want to point out the last two dates because I think it's staggering to see that the Inquisition wasn't officially taken off the books until 1834, and the expulsion order of the Jews not until 1968. I mean, obviously there were Jews living in Spain then, but to think that it was still on the books, I find, and basically in our modern times, staggering. But today, what we're really going to be focusing in is what is often referred to as the Golden Age. It's about a 250-year period. Again, I mark it with the beginning of Chazdai ibn Shaprut and what he did, and really ending with that invasion of those much more fanatic Muslim rulers. And that's Maimonides is sort of the tail end of the Golden Age. But the Golden Age is all relative, and I think it's important to note that as relatively speaking, it was a golden age. It's a golden age because there was just so much produced in so many different subject areas of philosophy and literature and halakha and Kabbalah and science and poetry and within the secular world and within the Jewish world. But it doesn't mean that everything was hunky-dory and it was kumbaya and everyone just loved their Jewish neighbor. We have to remember that as high as some Jews rose in society, whether it was within financially or in terms of being the right-hand men of many of the rulers, both Christian and Muslim, it was always because what could they do for those in power? The Jews themselves were never the ones wielding power. They were always being used for their talents, for their connections, for their money, for their resources, for their administrative abilities. And I think that's something that we should remember, and that it varied greatly over time as well as over space. So it depends where you were living in Sfarad and whether it was under Christian or Muslim rule, but more importantly, which Christian ruler and which Muslim ruler, because they varied greatly. I'm going to stop right there. Debbie, are there any questions about anything I just said now, or should I move on? Debbie, you can unmute yourself and let me know. Debbie, can you unmute yourself? You're okay? You can't unmute yourself. Oh, okay. Oh, because we didn't take off that thing. All right, so let me just check in the chat. Okay, everything's good. I'm gonna keep going. All right.
Kayla,
Yes.
I just want to suggest, just to say it explicitly, we encourage people to put questions into the chat. So we'll check the chat every once in a while.
I'm just, great. So Rabbi, if you can unmute yourself, or with Debbie, every once in a while, I'll just ask if there are any questions before we move on. But then we'll obviously have Q&A at the end. Just that when I'm in the presentation, I can't see any of you. So I'm a little bit talking to my screen. And I lose that sort of seeing what's going on. Okay, anyway, let me go back to sharing and back into presentation, and we will continue on. There we go. All right. So let's take a walk around Cordoba. First thing you're going to see in Cordoba, as well as in Toledo and in Granada and in Sevilla and many other different towns in Spain, are these brass markers, which are usually on the ground. And I think you can see that this is a samech, and then we have a pei, a resh, and a funky little dalet, and that of course spells out Sfarad. But within the negative of it, you can see a zayin, a kaf, a vav, and a resh, and that of course spells out Zachor, remember. And so there are all of these, many towns have now set up these routes within their Jewish neighborhoods, or what were the old Jewish neighborhoods, or as we called Chudaria, marking what were significant landmarks during when Jewish communities lived there. This is a view of the old city of Cordoba, taken across the river, the Guadalquivir. And right here is La Mezquita, and we're going to visit that inside a little bit. And La Mezquita is the mosque, which is now mosque/cathedral, and is probably one of the most beautiful and stunning buildings anywhere. Here's a view from afar, and this bridge that we see is actually from the Roman period. Remember, the Romans lived where the empire was here for a few hundred years, and they did what they do best, which is build bridges all over the place. So again, we have this is the Mezquita from afar. We can see the minaret, which was added, which is now a bell tower, and we'll continue on. As you walk through the old part of Cordoba, you have these beautiful alleyways with the whitewash. You see that all throughout southern Spain, throughout Andalusia, with the flower pots. Remember, it can get very, very hot there in the summer, incredibly hot. So by building very close together, you had a lot of shade into your homes. Also for safety. You could almost pass stuff from your neighbor without having to go outside of your house. So that was something that definitely in the Jewish neighborhoods also was important at different times when there were restrictions and when they didn't necessarily feel so safe with their other neighbors. As we continue on, here's another alleyway. Again, these beautiful, beautiful homes, lots of flowering plants. And here's a map of old Cordoba. All right, and so we can see again the river, the Guadalquivir, which is very important. And that was the Jewish neighborhood next to a main gate. And then over here is La Mezquita, okay? So that was, and in between the two is the Alcazar, which would have been the fortress. So the Jewish neighborhood was definitely integrated into the city. It was not, some far off place. It was, the Jews were definitely in the thick of things at that period. And in order to organize our little bit of the presentation, I thought that I would try to focus really on three people. So as I mentioned, one of them is Chazdai ibn Shaprut, who really, I think, is a great example of someone, of a Jew who rises to very high in power under the Islamic ruler at a time of what I like to call Pax Islamica. So I'll get into that a little bit more. The next person is Yehuda Halevi, and I'll also talk about another poet as well. But really this revolution in Hebrew poetry, which Yehuda Halevi takes things to a new level that then others continue on. And Maimonides, who I really think if very few people who are connected in any way to the Jewish community haven't heard of Maimonides. Many people who are not Jewish and are just, scholars of philosophy in general have heard of Maimonides or the Rambam. So we're going to look at some of maybe his lesser known writings to again see how the influence of Muslim philosophy, which was Greek philosophy, on Jewish philosophy and scholarship from Maimonides. So that's going to be a little bit of the topics we're going to get into. So let's start with Chazdai. Okay, so as I mentioned, Chazdai is living at a time period when Cordoba is really now the one of the most important cities in the Muslim world. He's this right-hand man to the Caliph Abdul al-Rahman III. In this picture here, we have Chazdai standing, and here's the Caliph sitting, and he's his right-hand man. He is knowledgeable in many languages. He serves as a diplomat. He serves as rules over his court, and he adopts a lot of different ways of what the Caliph is doing in the general Muslim world. He brings that and does the same within the Jewish community living there. So what was it that he was doing? So first of all, he was the court Jew. Okay, he was the second-hand man, as I mentioned. He would greet dignitaries. There's records of dignitaries coming from Germany, from other parts of Europe, and just like Abdullah Rahman was a patron to scholars, to linguists, to poets, to scientists. The same thing, Khazdai does the same thing. This is a time of what I like to call Pax Islamica, peace in the Islamic Empire. It's sort of a play on Pax Romana. But the idea when there was so much of the Muslim empire was united, and it leads to globalization in a way. Globalization, not maybe at the speed of our day, but that all these communities for thousands of miles were connected, were trading with each other, were trading ideas, we're trading goods, which were that you had so many of them under the same rule, which the Jews were actually able to take advantage of that and became great traders. They were very well positioned for that because a Jew could sort of wander into any town with other Jews and be given protection, make connections, speak the similar language. In Europe, it might have been Yiddish, but in here, all the Jews spoke Arabic as well, the traders definitely, and Judeo-Arabic. So it was very easy for them to take advantage of the economic activity under the Muslim Empire. What this leads to, though, is urbanization, and that's where we see Cordoba is becoming this great city with a huge university, a huge library, which again is because of Abdul Rahman. We also see decentralization. So as I mentioned that the caliphate moves west from what would have been Damascus or Baghdad, the same thing happens in the Jewish world. There's the shift from the yeshivot, the best yeshivot, and the place where you went to go study, and the place where you wrote your letter if you had a question about what to do to the rabbis. Instead of sending that letter to Baghdad, you would now be sending it to Cordoba, and within a century or two, you'd be sending it to a town called Lucena or Eliosana. And that would have been where the Harvard of yeshivot would have been here in Andalusia, as opposed to all the way in Baghdad. So scholars are moving, rabbis are moving, everyone is realizing that if you want to be in the center of Jewish halakha and Talmud study and everything, that you need to now be in Sfarad. There's also what happens is, it's hard to call it secularization, but there's definitely a blurring of what was considered religious and secular. You have to understand at this time, the Muslim world are translating all of the Greek sources. So whether it's math and whether it's philosophy and whether it's science and whether it's medicine, all of the classics, everything that was the height of Greek intelligence, Greek intellectual works are being translated into Arabic by the Muslim world. And then the Jews who know Arabic are now eventually also going to be the ones who are going to translate many of these works into the languages of the Christian world. So whether it's into Latin or into Castilian or Catalan or Romance, which are eventually going to be Spanish and French and Italian and everything as the centuries continue on. But where I understand is the Muslims are studying everything, especially Aristotle and Plato, as a way to understand this world, as a way to understand the divine. And that's definitely something that seeps into the Jewish world, definitely people like Maimonides, who realized that by studying science and astronomy, or they might have called it astrology, or alchemy, which was really chemistry, or algebra, and all these words, I don't know if you can hear the al in them, alchemy, algebra, algorithm, they're all from the Arabic. That by studying these things and understanding our physical world, it's a way of understanding God's creation, understanding the divine, and a way of relating with the divine. So secular studies were just another part of the menu for trying to get closer to God. And this is something unfortunately, I feel like is definitely we're losing right now. There's such a rift between the ultra-Orthodox and what we call the secular world in our time right now, but that's not how it used to be. And all of these things, the Pax Islamica, the urbanization, the decentralization, the secularization, or the blurring, we're going to see this being played out in the Hebrew poetry and in Jewish philosophy. So that's where we're going to be going in a little bit. But let's continue our walk. So first, as we continue to go through Cordoba and all of Andalusia, they use a heavy influence of Muslim architecture, of course, from Morocco, and it's a very hot climate, especially in the summer. So there are a lot of indoor patios, which provide shade. A lot of them have water sources and will have very fragrant citrus trees, a lot of oranges. But you don't want to eat any of these oranges. They are incredibly bitter, but very fragrant, but they make marmalade out of them. I guess you add enough sugar and anything can be sweet. And they're basically, you'll walk down the street and it looks we saw those streets are very narrow, but you basically would walk into an inner patio and all of the home would be around the patio. So from the street, you really can't tell the size and maybe the luxuriousness of any home until you get into the inside. Again, more of those oranges and these beautiful patios all over the place. And now we're going to start going into La Mesquita. So La Mesquita was originally a church, then became a mosque, expanded a number of times as the community grew and became wealthier. They expanded the mosque, so it's actually really, really large. And then eventually, after the Reconquista, it turns back into a cathedral. It has these gorgeous, gorgeous arches, double arches, and you can see the very typical Moorish use of color in the stones. And I wish I had better pictures, but I don't. To really capture this, you really need a professional photographer, not Kayla, the photographer. It's not so great, but it just keeps going on and on and on. It almost looks like a forest, all of the different arches. Of course, because it was a mosque, there was a mihrab. So we can see how beautifully decorated it was with the gold inlays and all the Arabic writing around it. So this is the prayer niche, which faces, if you're in Cordoba, it's going to face Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina, all of them, because basically they're all east of there. Over here on the left, we have some Arabic inscription. It's the Shahada, or the Declaration of Faith in Islam, and that's there. And on the right, I just wanted to capture that there's now beautiful stained glass, which was from when the cathedral was put in. They put in gorgeous stained glass, and you can see during the day the reflection and how beautiful the colors are in different places. On the left, we have later additions of columns from the Christian period, again, from when the cathedral was built within the Mesquita. And on the right, though, we have all of these other columns, which are from the mosque period. And it's a little bit hard to see, but right here, there's some etching. I don't know if you can see, there's some etching. Luckily, the archaeologists took plaster, what do you call it? These things, I'm losing my English. Of all of these different etchings. And what we find are signatures of the workers. So basically a worker who would work on a column, and the mason would eventually get to it, and then they would etch into it their names, so that that's how they would know, what was due them in terms of pay. And it's very interesting to see the myriad of languages. We have Arabic and Hebrew. I think right here, you can clearly see here's a Dalet, a Vav, and a Mem Sofit. But we have other things that are here. It looks like a shin, okay? And we have a Jewish star, Magen David. We have definite use of Hebrew and Arabic, which is showing us that the workers were both Jews and Muslims working on the mosque. We'll continue on. But as I mentioned, originally it's over where the Visigoth church was. So again, in the 5th century, the Visigoths built a very small, well, compared to what it is now, and a church. And this is a few feet down from what's now the current floor, but you can see there's a mosaic, a very nice mosaic for the time, considering that this is again 4th, 5th century. And then eventually, after the Reconquista, that the mosque is now turned back into a cathedral, and smack dab in the middle of it is the altar area. There's a huge organ. There's areas for mass and seats and, you know, everything that you would expect from a major cathedral. As I mentioned, smack dab in the middle of the mosque today. It is still an active church. There's mass said daily and definitely on all the festivals and Sundays. As we continue on, here's the gate that leads into the what was the Juderia, what was the Jewish part of the old city. And the name of the main street is Calle de Judíos, and that's what it was always called, and that's still what it's called. And it's no surprise that on that street, we're gonna find a number of other Jewish sites. One of them being the Plaza de Juda Levi. And this is actually a photo I took way back when. Quality isn't so fantastic. I think I took this on my first trip to Spain in 1990 when I was studying there for 3 months during college. And you can see that if anyone can read Spanish, it's the Oficina Municipal de Turismo. The city tourism office is right there. So in the middle of the Plaza de Juda Levi is where the tourist info is. And here's a pre-COVID shot of the cafe that is here in this plaza. And it's maybe a block away from La Mezquita, so very central, very active, and just a testament to the modern day Cordobans wanting to claim their Jewish heroes or Jewish figures. So whether it's Maimonides or someone like Chasdai ibn Shaprut or Yehuda Levi. Excuse me as I wet my whistle. And now Yehuda Levi takes me to where I want to speak a little bit about poetry. So biblical Hebrew poetry. Wait, let me pause for 1 second. Just make sure there are any questions, or should I keep going?
I have no questions so far, so keep going.
Great, thank you. Okay. Whoops, I went back by mistake. Okay, so this is just an example of a poem, which I think a lot of people know. It's, you know, part of Kabbalat Shabbat. It's part, whatever. It's it's Psalm 92. And at the end, Tzadik Katamar Yifrach, Ke'erez B'Levanon Yizgeh. And biblical Hebrew poetry was based on the idea of parallelism, that you state the same idea twice. So the righteous man will flourish like the palm tree. He will grow like a cedar in Lebanon. So it's the same idea, just said over again. Planted in the house of God, they will flourish in the courts of our God. So that was what really marked biblical poetry. What we have, we're going to see a shift, but first let's, I do have a little bit of music here, and maybe this will make this a little bit more familiar to you. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but a beautiful song, we sing it, but it's like very flowy. You have to be someone like Dudu Fisher to do it justice. when we talk about biblical poetry. Now, what's going to happen is someone by the name of Dunash ibn Labrat is going to come on the scene, and he is going to be, his patron is Chazdai ibn Shaprut, who's going to invite him into his courtyard, again, where he's sponsoring philosophers and linguists and people doing Hebrew grammar, and people like Dunash who are doing great things with Hebrew poetry. And Dunash is heavily influenced by Arabic poetry, and that is going to greatly change Hebrew poetry from this point going forward. So one of his first poems is called Dror Yikra, and I think many of you might have heard it. So let me just play the traditional version here, a few stanzas. And if you want to sing along at home, no one's going to hear you if you're on mute, so have fun.
דרור יקרא לבני מבט, בת, 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 והנה צורכם כמו בבת, בת, 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 נעים שמכם ולא יושבת, בת, 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 שבו ונוחו ביום שבת, בת, 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 דרוש נביא ואולמי, מי, ואות ישעשה מי, נטסו רק בתוך כרמי, מי, שעשה ואת בני עמי, מי.
Okay, I think you get the idea, but all of a sudden, it's not Sadika Tamar, it's all of a sudden, Dror Yikra Living Imbat, right? What do we have? Rhythm, and we have rhyme. And what we also have is something which does happen in poetry, Hebrew poetry before this, but the use of acrostics gets bumped up to a higher level. And I don't know if you can see, but the first stanza starts with a dalid, the second one with a vav, the third one with a noon, the fourth one with the shin. And what does that spell? Dunash. So he's spelling his name. That's a way of him signing it. And we'll have that here on the last one as well. We find that in so many poems now that they are embedding their own names into the poetry, or they're using, they're doing things alphabetically, or putting the tetragrammaton or other things, and using acrostics is another way of shaping the poetry. And again, this is all coming from Arabic influence. Now, when you have rhythm and rhyme, you can sing almost anything. You know, think of Adon Olam, which was written most likely by Shlomo ibn Gvirol. But here also, Dror Yikra, you can sing it many different ways. And here's another, I think, very fun version. Okay, who doesn't love the Maccabees? They're awesome. So again, thank you to Dunash for kicking off something that is going to gain traction and go off in crazy places by people like Shlomim Gavul and of course Yuda Levi. So as I mentioned, you have rhyme, meter, acrostics, but what's also greatly influenced by the Arabic is the subject matter. Of course, there's Shabbat and liturgical poems, which is what we might be most familiar with because they show up in our Siddur or we sing them around the Shabbat table. But there are also erotic and love poems. There were poems about friendship. They would have poetry slams. People would go to pubs and basically on the spot come up with poems. And then their friend would respond. And a lot of them also, they would write letters to each other with beautiful poetry about their friendship. Another thing was incorporating cosmology and nature into the poetry. And again, this is a time when astronomy is making great heights, great strides. And this, we think it's sort of strange, but you'll have poems that are actually read in the liturgy that are talking about the zodiac or talking about the different known planets at the time. They didn't know exactly about all of them, but talking about their orbits and the phases of the moon and comets and everything like that. And lastly, there were also these riddles and drinking poems, which I think we find a little strange, but it was quite common. And here's, I love this quote. And this is another poem by Ben Labrat, so our friend Dunash of blessed memory, about the ways of drinking in the evening and in the morning, accompanied by musical instruments. And the sound of water. Remember, we talked about the patio, you having water, those inner patios. The sound of water courses and the plucking of strings and the chirping of birds from the branches with the scent of all sorts of incense and herbs. All this he described at a gathering convened by Chazdai, the Sephardi, may he rest in peace. And he said, drink, he says, don't drowse. Drink wine aged well in barrels. So that picture of the of Chazdai bringing together this courtyard of intellectuals, of poets, but it was also a great place to hang out. You know, people drinking and being creative and listening to music. And again, that was a direct influence of what was going on in the Caliph's palace, the same thing going on in his courtyard as well. I just want to take a step and tip our hats to the people who are doing all the research and the Cairo Geniza. And I found this and I just thought it was just so interesting, fascinating. I wanted to share it with you. On the left-hand side, we have, well, actually, we have two fragments that were in the Geniza. The one on the left was found many years ago, and people translated it. And you can see here, if you can read that, the Hebrew, it says Dunash ben Labrat. Whoa, here is something that Dunash ben Labrat wrote. And we have on the left, we have the poem. Aha, if it's not that simple. Can you see how the right-hand section and the left-hand section actually fit together? You can see right here the tier, all right? And so what we're missing when we put them together is Lidona Dunash Labrat, okay? Dona, like Don Quixote, Don Dona, which is this Castilian a word for like a lady or wife of. So this poem was not written by Dunash, it was written by Dunash's wife. And very recently, I think in this past decade, someone stumbled upon the right-hand side, read the poetry and said, this really reminds me of this other poem from the Geniza, put the two together, realized they're one poem written by her, not by him. And it's just amazing. And here's the translation. I won't get into it too much. I just want to say they had a very rocky marriage and they were writing letters back to each other. And she was always wondering, you know, are you going to come back to me or not? And are we really, you know, are we splitting for good? So they had a rocky marriage, but this is one of the only poems that we know was written by a woman from that time. But as I mentioned, where Dunash is just getting things started, and then they're actually going to be taken to greater extents by people like Yehuda Levi. He's a generation later. He's born in the north in Tudela. He dies in Eretz Yisrael. We don't know exactly where or when, but we do know that he does make Aliyah eventually, something that he dreamed about his whole life. He wrote about it extensively. He lived in Cordoba, he lived in Granada, he lived in Toledo. He would move around. Again, he's at that time period where the Muslim rules is shifting. And at some point he realizes it's better for him to go north into Christian Toledo. He writes hundreds of maybe 1,000 poems. And we have a lot of them. A lot of them ended up in the Geniza. Many of them were just copied and were incorporated into Sidurim and into our liturgy. He also wrote a book of Jewish philosophy called the Kuzari. Many have said, leave the philosophy to Maimonides and leave the poetry to Yehuda Halevi. He definitely doesn't have the same philosophical chops that someone like Maimonides has, and it can be rolling some others. But no one can really, almost no one can touch him in terms of what he does with poetry. Here's a poem, just a line from one of his poems. Tzion halo tish'ali l'shalom asiraich, shivat shvutech ani kino l'shiraich. And that might ring a bell to anyone who's familiar with Naomi Shemer's Yerushalayim of gold, Yerushalayim shel zahav, v'shel nechoshet v'shel or, halo l'chol shiraich ani kinor. So he not only was influencing other poets of his day, he's here, 1967, Naomi Shemer is being greatly influenced by the poem that he wrote. The poem, this Tzion halo tish'ali, is actually something that he wrote to be read at Tisha B'Av. So the connection again that, Tisha B'Av is about the Jews being exiled, and the destruction of the Second Temple. And Naomi Shemer is writing Jerusalem of Gold after the reunification of Jerusalem in 67. So it's really the fact that she's, it's an answer to what he's writing in terms of poetry for Tisha B'Av. Another one of his most famous poems is this Libi B'Mizrach. Again, he's one of the earliest Zionists, long before Herzl and Ahad Ha'am and all these guys in the 1800s. He is always talking about Eretz Yisrael, his longing to be in Eretz Yisrael. My heart is in the east and I am in the uttermost west. And at those times, if you were in Sfarad, you really were as far west as anyone knew. How can I find savor in food? How should it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds while yet Sion lies beneath the fetters of Edom and I in Arab chains? And remember, Edom is the word basically for any enemies of the Jews, and usually at this point in time, Christians. So remember, again, we're in that time period of, it's about the time of the First Crusade. A light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain. See how precious in my eyes it would be to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. Remember, at this time, Spain, Sfarad is, a very wealthy, intellectual, cultured place. And Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael at that time is, a dung heap. It's really, there's nothing going on. It's barren, it's poverty, there's almost no Jewish community to speak of. And yet he's, the whole time, he's struggling with this for his adult life about how can I live here and not go to Zion. And eventually he does make his way to Eretz Yisrael. As I mentioned, he sails from Sfarad. He stops off in Fustat, which is Old Cairo, and he's in Alexandria. Remember, at that time, you could only travel at certain months of the year, depending on the weather, because you were sailing. And he ends up spending almost a year in Egypt. And he's so well known. He's treated like royalty. He's hosted by the wealthiest people in the community. Everyone's asking him questions, and he's writing poems and letters and everything, and he's being treated really well. But he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk, and eventually he does get on a ship. He does make his way to Eretz Yisrael, and we lose track of them, and we know that he does die somewhere in Eretz Yisrael. I just wanted to bring one more poem, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's sung a lot on Shabbat because it's called Yom Shabbaton. I'm terrible at singing, so I will save you that. But again, just to read, to feel the rhythm and to feel the rhyme. Yom Shabbaton ein lishkoach, zichruch karech v'anichoach, yona matzah bo manoach, v'san yanuchu yagia koach. Okay, so Again, it's beautiful, and it's got many tunes to it, because when you have meter and rhyme, it's very easy to do stuff like that. Okay, without further ado, we're going to continue on. Walking through the Jewish quarter, and I think some of you might recognize some of the people in this picture. And this is the Plaza de Tiberiades, which is the Spanish word for Tiberias, which is the city on the Sea of Galilee on the Kinneret, where that is a sculpture of Maimonides. Under his feet are nice and clean because everyone rubs his feet, his little booties, but you can see here's his signature. We actually know what his signature looked like because he signed so many documents that we found in the Geniza. And he does actually make his way to Eretz Israel, and he's buried in Tiberias. So that's why it's named the Plaza de Tiberiades. They're very happy to claim Maimonides, as well as Seneca and Averroes, who are two other philosophers who are from Cordoba. And I just sort of, every time I go to Cordoba, I take a picture of me in front of the Hotel Maimonides, which is directly across from the Mesquita. So again, it's like on the main drag, Maimonides' name all over the place. They're very, very proud of him. He's born in Cordoba, again, at about the age of bar mitzvah age. His family leaves and they wander through Andalusia and eventually make their way into Morocco. There are some who say that this family might actually have been forced to convert to Islam and then revert to their Judaism once they are out of the reach of the Almohads. And for this reason, a lot of his response, he's actually very easy on conversos compared to other people. He's on people who are forced to convert and want to go back to Judaism. He makes it very easy in many of his responses to do so. He travels to Eretz Yisrael. He ends up in Egypt. He settles there. His brother David is a businessman. He basically supports him, so he's able to work on his Mishnah Torah, on the guide to the perplexed, and all these things. Because he has a patron in his brother. His brother, however, is killed. His ship goes down on a trade mission. And at that point, Rambam really needs to get a job. And what most Jews at that time did were they were physicians. And he's the physician, not to the Sultan, but to the Sultan's assistant, and makes a real name for himself. And he dies in Fustat, but is buried in Tiberias, as I mentioned. He's known, he's a neo-Aristotelian. He likes Aristotle a lot, and I just thought I'd bring you some texts that maybe we don't hear about so much, but I think are quite relatable. And one of them is, he talks about the golden mean. So he goes on and on and on about the different temperaments that we have, how you should always strive for the middle ground, how you shouldn't be too one way or too another way, and that you need to find balance in everything in your life. So like just the first paragraph here, there are many temperaments, all of which are different and each of which is distinct and which are possessed by different people. There are people of angry disposition who are always annoyed, and there are those who are even-tempered and are never angry, and if they do get angry, it's only slightly and rarely. There are people who are excessively haughty, and there are people who are excessively meek. The way of the upright is to adopt the intermediate characteristic of each and every temperament that people have. That's being equidistant from the two extremes, and you need to work on this. Okay, so he's the golden mean. Now, where does he get it? As I mentioned, from Aristotle. He talks about the golden mean is desirable between two extremes, as well as Socrates. One must know how to choose the mean and avoid the extremes on either side. Having both qualities produces harmony, beauty, and goodness. All right, so as I mentioned, that chain of transmission of the Greek philosophers into Arabic by the Muslims, and then makes its way from into the Jewish world, and from there eventually into the Christian world. His thoughts on health. Remember, he's a physician, and you know, he didn't get everything right, but I think he got a lot of things, especially the idea of holistic medicine, he seemed to understand. Preventing aging is impossible, but delaying its arrival is entirely possible. One should always exercise all of one's body parts. The best kind of exercise are ones which causes the body to also wake up the soul. For awakening the soul and causing it happiness will heal the body of all kinds of sicknesses. So he gets that mind over body, or that relationship of mind to body, and the importance of exercise. I love this. Overeating is like a deadly drug and the root of all disease. And then do not sleep after eating, but wait 3 or 4 hours. I must say, that's, for him, that was pretty easy to say, because the guy never slept. He got maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, because he was he was the physician attending the Sultan's secondhand guy all day long and healing people. And then he would come home, and then he was sort of the local rabbi for the community there, and have to deal with all sorts of questions and problems and things from the community, as well as his own scholarly endeavors of working on, at this point in time, he's going to be really working on the Guide to the Perplexed. And putting all those things together, he didn't really have time to sleep. So maybe a little bit of do as I say and not as I do from the Rambam. As we continue on, down the street is the synagogue of Cordoba, often referred to as the synagogue of Rambam, but as we mentioned, he was already in the 11th century, he's out of there, and this synagogue, as you can see from the date, is to the 14th century, from when it was built / really renovated. So we have a view from the main street. This is the view on the left, and then on the right is from inside looking out that main door, and we can see how beautifully it's decorated with this plaster etching, which is very popular at the time. And for those of you who remember being in the Toledo synagogue, especially the El Tránsito synagogue, it's very similar, this style decoration. It's called Muhadar, and it pops up in Christian and Jewish and Muslim buildings of the time all over the place. The area on the right would have been where the Aron Kodesh was placed. And what we have is an inscription. We have the plaque. Every synagogue that gets renovated has to have the plaque. It's sort of hard to read the Hebrew. The letters are okay, but as you can see, they don't really use spacing. So everything sort of just like squishes in from one to the other. But I have the translation on the bottom. This minor sanctuary is being refurbished by Yitzchak Machab, son of the wealthy Ephraim. We can see here Yitzchak. You see Yitzchak, Machab, Ben, and then here's Ephraim. You can see that. Then this is the year. Some of you might be able to make out Shnat Shiv'im v'chamisha. Okay, so the Hebrew year 5075, and may God remove curses from our nation and rebuild Jerusalem soon. Okay, so that is the synagogue. And then across the street is this great museum called Casa de Sfarad, which we're pretty sure was actually a very large Jewish home. The indoor patio, which we can, of course, like any good home at the time, would have a beautiful indoor patio. And then there's a number of different rooms, which all focus on something different. This one here on the left is sort of a panel about the life of Maimonides. About what I think is thrilling is some of the other artifacts they have. They have a set of what look like Christian works, Christian prayer books. You can see in the yellow here, it's Latin. But if you open it up, what do we see? It's actually, this is the book of Ezekiel, of Yechezkel, that these would have been used by conversos, or of crypto Jews. So anyone who would walk into the house would think that they were being very good Christians with what's on their library and on their bookshelf, but those who would open it would see that actually they were reading their Jewish sources. I was there with a group, and we actually celebrated B'nai Mitzvah. We had a bar and a bat mitzvah. Maybe the first bar mitzvah in 500 years, but probably the first bat mitzvah ever. And the arrow here is pointing to the Aron Kodesh of today. The synagogue, the Sefer Torah was donated by the World Union of Progressive Judaism. And it was absolutely thrilling to reclaim vibrant Jewish life in the city of Cordoba after basically a 500-year pause. There's barely any community in Andalusia, very small, a little bit in Seville, a little bit in Cordoba, 10 people in Granada. But the Barcelona and Madrid have really thriving Reform and conservative, as well as Moroccan Orthodox Kihilot that are bouncing back. We see people who, there's a lot of like South Americans, Argentinians who are Ashkenazi actually, who came in the 90s and also more recently when there were the economic issues in South America. But also people with Moroccan roots, and also a lot of people who know that they're descendants of conversos who are reclaiming their Jewish roots and going back to Judaism. So it's a very interesting Jewish community that's reforming in modern day Spain. One of the other things that they do here in Casa de Sfarad are Ladino concerts. So we're going to play this. I apologize ahead of time. For some reason, when I hit play, the sound is fine, but the picture flips. But we don't really need to look what's going on. We just really need to hear what he's saying. All right, I'll put the volume up a little. He's doing a little intro.
Alla fiera Vélez per 2 soldi un topolino mio padre comprò, e alla fiera Vélez per 2 soldi un topolino mio padre comprò, e vieni il gatto che si mangiò il topo, che al mercato mio padre comprò, e vieni il cane che morsi il gatto che si mangiò il topo, che al mercato mio padre comprò, e vieni il bastone che picchiò il cane che morsi il gatto che si mangiò il topo, che al mercato mio padre comprò, e alla fiera Vélez per 2 soldi un topolino mio padre comprò, e alla fiera Vélez per 2 soldi un topolino mio padre comprò.
Okay, so let me go back. I think some of you, if anyone knows a little bit of Spanish, you can hear Ladino is very, very close to Old Castilian. In fact, a lot of people, linguists, are studying Ladino in order to learn about the development of Castilian into Spanish. And if you heard El Gato and Mi Padre Compró, so the cat, and my dad bought it, and what he's talking about, the perrito. So this is Chad Gad Ya in Ladino, okay? So, you know, that's my dad bought the goat for 2 zuzim, you know, we sing, when we sing that here in the Castilian, we can see that the cat ate the this, it ate the that, whatever. And I'll just go to the next slide is another Ladino. This one will flip over to be upright. And just a word about these musicians, none of them are Jewish. These are all just people studied the conservatory in Cordoba and really love Ladino and the old music.
En la ciudad de Toledo, en la ciudad de Granada, allí se criaron mancebo que Diego León se llama. Él era alto de cuerpo, morenito de su cara, delgadico de cintura, mozo criado entre damas. Juan Diego se enamoró de una muy hermosa dama, se miran por una reja, también por una ventana.
Okay, now continue. All right, and this is how I'd like to close in conclusion, that the legacy of what happened in that 200-year period lives on to this day. And I think most of us actually come from Ashkenazi roots. There might be some of us have some Sephardi roots, but by and large, we Boston Jews are Ashkenazi. Definitely Temple Beth Am was, and B'nai Torah and everything, B'nai Tikva, sorry, we're Ashkenazi. But when we talk about what it means to do Jewish in our daily lives or our weekly lives or yearly lives, when we talk about what it means, how we express our Judaism, chances are it's going back to something that happened in Sfarad. So whether it's studying halachic works like the Mishnah Torah, which was written by Maimonides, or the Shulchan Aruch, which was written actually by Yosef Karo, who's in Tzfat, but he's born in Sfarad, and his family leaves during the expulsion and end up in Tzfat, so that he's steeped in that Sephardi culture. Jewish philosophy and mysticism. So again, the Guide to the Perplexed, the Zohar, the Kabbalah, all of these things start in Sfarad and make their way into Ashkenaz, and things like Kabbalah, obviously, Tzfat is a major center as well. Synagogue life, the whole idea of Kabbalat Shabbat comes from Tzfat, and these are the Sephardi guys who were kicked out of Spain, and they come up with this idea of greeting the Sabbath bride. And Lecha Dodi is written in Tzfat, and again, that beautiful poetry with rhyme, with meter, with the acrostic built in, with the name Shlomo is built into it. Shlomo Alkabetz writes it, and he builds his name into the stanzas. When we sing Adon Olam, when we sing Yigdal, so many of the piyutim, the poetry that we read over the high holidays, most of these are written by Sephardi poets. Ibn Gvirol, Yehuda Levi, Shmuel Ibn Nigrela, so many more. It comes from there. And in our ritual life, maybe a week or two ago, did you have a Tu B'Shvat Seder? Again, this comes out of the Sephardi people from Tzfat. The whole notion of Tikkun Olam, which is so important to so many of us as we express our Judaism, again, is from Rabbi Yitzchak Luria Ha'ari, who makes his way to Tzfat in the 1500s. And many of our Shabbat songs, as I mentioned, Yom Shabbaton by Yehuda Levi is just one of the many. So it's really, I don't think, can be underestimated how much influence a few hundred years way back when in Sfarad has had on all of our daily lives. And with that, I am going to jump out of this and be able to see you all. I'm going to stop sharing, and we can hopefully get to some questions.
I want to thank Kayla. That was fascinating, truly fascinating. And it, as many people commented, that it supplemented some of the learning that we've been doing at B'nai Tikva, and I'm sure other people have been doing elsewhere. Really brought things to life. So I open up to questions. I imagine that rather than chatting, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, well, I'm also, let me just read through. How many Jews are there in Cordoba now? I think I addressed that, like a handful. There's almost no community. If they want to do any ritual life, they have to drive about an hour to Sevilla, where there's a very small Reform and a very small Moroccan, which means Orthodox community. Okay, so that was, there aren't a lot of questions in the chat. Okay, so yes, unmute, let me make it so that people can unmute themselves and ask. Hold on, let me figure out how to do that.
I do have a question while you're waiting, while you're doing that.
All right, allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay.
I have a question while we're waiting for people to come up with their questions. Years ago, when I was teaching at Beth Am, I was in Spain, and I went to all the places you're talking about, and it was around Purim time. So I was I told my students I was going to come back and report to them what my experience in Purim was in Cordoba and Toledo, and I couldn't find an active synagogue or Jewish community at the time. Have people been moving from the centers of Madrid and Barcelona out towards the southern part of Spain in this area now? Are there bigger communities? I know you said there is a little.
So a little. There's also in Malaga and Gibraltar. Say it like a Boston, Gibraltar. There's again these Orthodox communities, which are Moroccan communities. These were people who have been merchants, for the past 150 years, who have been living in Gibraltar and living in Malaga in southern Spain. But in terms of Ashkenazi progressive, really Madrid, Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia have communities, which it's enough that you can actually show up on a Shabbat and there'll be people there, and they have Hebrew school, and they have studying, and they have learning, and they have what we consider a fairly vibrant community, but very small. You're talking 20, 30, 40 people, maybe 50 during the Chagim. A lot of them might be students, American students studying, things like that. So you're not going to have big, and most of them don't necessarily have, they don't have a synagogue. Most of them meet in like a community center type building or storefront or something. They don't have big spaces like we're used to. And often it's a little sad, but they're not very well marked. Because of anti-Semitism. So you have to know where you're going. Their website are not going to say, here's our address. If you want to join them, you have to send your passport. Then they'll tell you where to come. Then you have to get checked by security, which it's not like that in Portugal, which is very interesting. But in Spain, it's definitely, the Jewish community does not feel very secure. So that's, I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. There is a question from Marilyn Feinberg. Marilyn, if you can just unmute yourself, you'll be welcome to ask a question.
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, Kayla, it's great to see you again.
It's nice to see you too.
I am so happy to listen in on this. I was a Spanish teacher for many years and remember taking, Joel and I went, and then I took a group of students to Cordoba and many other cities. One quick comment, we had gone to Toledo and I had asked for the Jewish community there, and everything was closed that day. And we had a guide who must have remembered. And we went into the cathedral, the church, whatever. And of course, many of the architects were Jewish, and you see these little symbols of their marks that they left. And he said to all of us, and he commented on that. He said, after all, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And I said, oh my God, I just got the chills. But I was going to ask you about the anti-Semitism.
Wait, what year was that in? I'm just interested. What year was that?
That was in, let me see, I think it was 2007.
Okay, all right.
Okay, that was 2007, which was like incredible.
It's recent.
Yeah. Anyway, more recent than when I saw you. More, later, before we saw you. But anyway, I was going to ask you about the anti-Semitism, because I remember when we were there at that time, we saw a lot of anti-Semitic writings on the walls, and you read about them because of the huge immigration from the Muslim countries. What is the story there now?
So I think it's very similar to how it is in many places, like in France and other parts of Europe. So yes, there's influence from the Muslim community, but also there's just a lot of like Christian anti-Semitism the roots are so deep.
Always.
So it really, it's not super blatant. It's not like I walked around and I felt like, oh my gosh, but clearly the Jewish community themselves do feel like they need to keep a low profile, which is, coming from Israel is very sad. We're used to not having to keep a low profile. That's the whole reason why I'm here. And it definitely is caught up in the BDS, anti-Zionism thing. So as we know, a lot of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionist today is really anti-Semitism. That said, I think a lot of the younger community, the younger people are very willing to hold up a mirror to their history and to retell the story, to be more accurate in their portrayal of what actually happened with the Inquisition and with the expulsion, and to say we really messed up. The minute we threw out our Jews, that was not good for us. That was not a smart move. It was very short-sighted, and whenever a culture or a people are really bad to their Jews, it's really forebodes decline in many other ways. And for that, I want to tell you two quick stories, because I think they will show the shift or what's going on between. So my first trip to Spain was in 1990. I was studying on a program. I lived with a family in Granada. My Spanish used to be fantastic. Now it's not because of Hebrew, but whatever. And my family came to visit me because we had a break, and we toured around on a regular, American Express tour of Spain and Portugal, and we're in Toledo, and we are in, for anyone who knows, the El Greco, the museum is next to the Transito Synagogue.
Yep.
And we think that Shmuel Levi, who was the #2 guy to the king, King Pedro, was very wealthy, and he probably built the synagogue. And this was most likely his home. It was right next there. And we're downstairs on the tour. Of course, we have an English tour guide, but I'm listening to the other tour group next to us with a Spanish tour guide. And we're downstairs in the basement where there are 2 kitchens. And the Spanish tour guide says to her group in Spanish, yes, this home was owned by a very wealthy Jewish family, and in the early 1500s, they gave it to the family of El Greco. And I was like, what? And I'm like elbowing my mom. I'm like, Mom, you gotta hear what they just said. The family just gave it, out of the goodness of their heart. Let's just give it. But that was how they glossed over completely the history. Fast forward to being there with a few groups in recent times. And again, this tour guide is completely telling the history. And of course, we the Inquisition, and we have what's his name? Father Vicente, with these horrible, making the Jews sit into these anti-Semitic tirades on Shabbat, that he comes in and preaches to them, and how horrible it is, and obviously leading to the expulsion. And the other quick story I have is very recently, though, with an older tour guide. So he was, probably went to high school in the 70s, as opposed to the tour guide that I just mentioned, who was much younger. And we're in the Alhambra in Granada, and he is talking about how with the expulsion, that Jews actually had a number of options where they could leave, they could convert, or they could pay a higher tax and stay. And I was like, no, that wasn't one of the options. It was, you could die, you could, but I said, even people like a Barbanel, who was like the right-hand man of, who's financing Ferdinand and Isabella, he left. I'm like, that wasn't an option. He's like, no, but, and I was like, okay, let's just move on, but that was the way he was probably taught in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think that answers that a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Ruth Suarez. I'll read it to you.
Okay, let me see the chat. Okay. So the government isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, as we know that there's people around who are, okay? But how do I answer this diplomatically? It's maybe in Spain's better interests to bring some Jews back into the country, into the fold, for economic reasons. That's also all of these Jewish roots. When I showed you those brass plaques at the beginning, and how all these little towns all over the place are like, publicizing their Jewish roots, because they want Jewish tourists. Jews like to tour. We like to go see our roots. We've got a lot of us, leave some money along the way, and it's good business. So I think that has something to do with the government doing that. But also, the Inquisition's over, the expulsion's over. Spain is much more modern. It's post-Franco. You have to remember, up until 77, when would Franco kicked out of power? Spain, in a way, is a young democracy. It's only been really democratic for a few decades. So, it's going to take them a little bit of time to get on board.
Are there any other questions? Can you tell us something about the relationship between Israel and Spain at this time? I know you said Spain is not anti-Semitic as a government,
right? But
what is the diplomatic relationship between the two?
No, very good diplomatic relationships. Very good diplomatic relationships. Full embassies and everything. Remember the pre-Oslo Accords, right? Remember when the Palestinians and the Israelis were negotiating in private in the early 90s? They were doing it in Madrid. Remember, it was the Madrid Accords which led to the Oslo Accords. So they're definitely, I think, I wouldn't say Spain is unique from most other Western European countries vis-a-vis Israel.
Great.
There's a lot of cultural exchange. There's a lot of like, because of the Ladino thing and flamenco, Israelis love flamenco, and there'll be flamenco, Spanish flamenco dancers coming to Israel to perform, and Idan Reichel and all these other, a lot of these modern Israeli artists who are reclaiming their Sephardi roots and are singing in Ladino and are singing in old Piyutim, or performing in Spain and everything. There's a big, in Cordoba, a huge festival of Jewish culture in the summer.
So I don't, there are a couple people who might have questions, but rather than raising your hands because it's hard to see everybody, please unmute yourself and speak up. Any other questions? There are some comments, but questions? Well, I'm going to say
okay, I just see the comment that someone just made about their guide sort of saying you didn't know for sure. That's actually a very typical thing. When you ask the guides or other people, you say, they're devout Catholics or lapsed Catholics, their families now. In a way, Spain is very secular, in terms of its Catholicism. But a lot of them will say, oh, yeah, I'm not Jewish as far as I know. Like, it's a huge, definite possibility that you go back far enough and my family is Jewish, because they got to be, because 10% of them, if you look at the numbers, 10% of Spaniards have Jewish roots. So
all the DNA testing you can do now.
That's right. I mean, DNA would really show a lot.
So on behalf of myself, who as president of Suburban South Hadassah, and on behalf of Karen, who is the First Lady, and Peter Kurzberg, who is the president of B'nai Shalom, and the Adult Education Committee, and the president, Natalie Weinberg, who is the president of Beth Am and the Adult Education Committee there, and Rabbi Gordon, and all of you who came. I hope you enjoyed. The comments I'm getting are that everybody really enjoyed this. It was fascinating, it was entertaining, it was delightful. And Karen, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing this for us. It was a wonderful way to spend a Sunday in the winter, for sure. And it was a great trip. And those of you who enjoyed this trip, we'll have opportunities in the future. I know B'nai Tikva is planning a real live through TSA.
I'm working on it today. We can do a plug for November 7th to 18th. Okay, so just waiting for flights, and I'll be sending the information to Rabbi Gordon so that you guys can.
Right. So
get going.
And Kayla is in charge of a wonderful program in Israel, and I hope you all get to see her again in some capacity. So I'm saying for all of you in your name, thank you so much, Kayla. It was delightful seeing you. It was delightful listening to you, and I appreciate it. And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Goodbye.
It was nice.
Kayla's
I'll stay on for a minute. Yeah.
Okay, stay for a minute.
Right. Yeah, and if anyone else does a question, wants to stay on, I'm happy to.
I was just saying, Kayla, that I'm so sad because my grandson's bar mitzvah is November 14th, that Saturday, and I wanted to go on that trip. And Hadassah is also the Bigger Givers is doing a trip to Israel at that same date, and I can't make either of them because of the bar mitzvah.
Oh no!
So,
well, that's a good reason. That's a good reason not to come.
From a selfish point of view, I'm thinking maybe they'll change the date.
Well, talk to Rabbi Gordon.
Ruth Suarez has her hand raised if she still does.
Oh, Ruth Suarez. Which I think she had a question going back about Franco, correct, Ruth?
I don't know if she's still here.
Right. So, Ruth, I am not, as my expertise, whatever it is really for 500 to 1,000 years ago, and less so under Franco. Remember, there just weren't a lot of Jews living in Spain under Franco. I mean, there just weren't. So it's hard to say what was life like for them because there are hardly any. We're talking handfuls here and there. And if they were most likely people with another foreign passport who maybe were like business people living there and stuff like that. But to say that there was really any type of vibrant Jewish community under Franco is just not gonna fly. But I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that Franco did sort of turn a blind eye to a lot of Jews who were escaping Nazi Europe from France, crossing into Spain before continuing on, most likely either to England or to these states. So he could have clamped down a little bit more in that than he did. So we should acknowledge
okay.
that, not that he was, you know, he
Oh,
still
oh,
was,
did he?
you know,
I don't
you
know.
know, part of
Somebody
the
else.
axis of evil.
Any other comments and questions? Well, if you think of anything and it's a burning question you want to know, send it to me and I will send it to Kayla and we'll get an answer and I'll get back to you.
Right.
Okay?
That's right. That's
All
right.
right. All right. So I think everybody loved it. And once again, have a lovely day and thank you, Kayla.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
for inviting us, Debbie, and letting us join you
My
all.
pleasure.
It was
I'm
a
going to
wonderful
call
program,
Judy now, her
Kayla.
mother, to tell her what a wonderful guide she was.
Okay.
Yeah, you need to send her the link. She's not going to find it on her own to watch it. Oh,
Yeah,
I
well,
should
I'll
have
have to
just
wait
said
till
that. Wait, should I
I'll have to-
stop the record?
Yes, stop recording. Yeah.
I will when I find